Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome here to the Bibliothèque Solvay. Before handing over to our President, Mr. Tavares, just a few words about the year which is behind us, 2017, which was, of course, another challenging year for the industry. However, at the same time, a year in which we have seen good progress being made in addressing some of the issues in our sector. We have now clarity on emission testing, with new testing methods being adopted and in place since September last year, what is called in the technical jargon WLTP, which is now a much more stringent lab test to follow by all manufacturers, which is complemented by a test on the road, real driving emissions test. We have that, which is in force now since last year. Second, we have a complete new type approval system, which is put in place, which is also providing for clarity, not only for OEMs, but also for users and type approval authorities, which is also much more robust than we had before. Okay. So these are two, I would say, important measures which have been now put in place, which hopefully will help also to rebuild consumer trust and confidence in our sector. Of course, more is to come, and we are working on more of the challenges ahead of us. We know that we continue to see a challenge being expressed on diesel. We need to re-emphasize that diesel continues to be important also in the future, and that all manufacturers have invested and continue to invest heavily in state-of-the-art exhaust after treatment systems to make these diesel vehicles not only more performant, but also less polluting than ever before. So again, that doesn't mean it's all over. There's more to come, and there's more we want to address. We're committed to move forward to address all these challenges constructively in dialogue with the different players, including the policymakers. And of course, 2018, the year in which we now started, we have a few new things coming up which are so important to our industry. And so with that, I think it's important to give the floor to our President, who will give you perspective on the year ahead.
Thank you very much, Erik. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be here with you and share a few thoughts about our industry. But before speaking about what is ahead of us, I would like to review the market situation last year in 2017. This year was, for the European car market, the fourth consecutive year of growth. The EU passenger car sales grew by 3.4% compared to 2016, bringing the total number of cars sold to 15.1 million units. While this is positive, it must be noted that it has taken us a full decade to come close to pre-crisis sales figure. So I would like to underline that fact. We need also to recognize that political uncertainty in the Eurozone as well as the UK will likely result in a slowdown in growth this year, in 2018. And we forecast that car sales will edge up by around 1%. So we forecast a very limited growth for the car market in 2018. Production data for the full year 2017 is not yet available, but results from January to September show that EU passenger car output was stable compared to the first 3 quarters of 2016. It is estimated that 16.7 million cars were produced in total last year. Here again, we are coming close to pre-crisis levels, but the situation is still very fragile. As we embark on a new year, it is crucial that we maintain this trajectory of recovery within Europe, as well as safeguarding the competitiveness of our industry on the global level. This is all the more important as we now face new CO2 targets for cars and vans, regulations that will have a major impact on the future of the European auto industry, as well as the threat posed by Brexit. And I will say a few words about these topics. On CO2, As for CO2, late last year, the European Commission published its proposal for post-2021 targets for cars and vans. ACEA welcomes the fact that the date for the long-term CO2 targets has been set for 2030, as it gives us the ability to prepare for this challenge. The proposed reduction level of 30%, however, goes beyond what was agreed under the Climate and Energy Framework to meet the COP21 objectives and puts the global competitiveness of the European auto industry at risk. We are still trying to understand the rationale of this discrepancy. Also, the proposal for an additional 15% reduction target already in 2025 is too much too soon. Coming just 4 years after the targets already set for 2021, it will leave hardly any time for our industry to make the necessary technical changes to the vehicles. Whatever the level will be, reaching future CO2 targets will strongly depend on much higher sales of alternative powered vehicles. And this will only happen with an EU-wide rollout of recharging and refueling infrastructure, as well as harmonized incentives to stimulate customers to buy such vehicles. In particular, a minimal level of infrastructure density is a precondition for the industry to achieve ambitious CO2 goals. Particularly when we see the low and fragmented market uptake of alternative powered vehicles across Europe today, we believe that this proposal needs to be examined very carefully by all policymakers. One important message we have for them is that when it comes to decarbonisation, it is the results that should matter and not the technological pathway that each manufacturer chooses to deliver them. In other words, policymakers should, of course, fix ambitious objectives for CO2 reductions, but should not impose the technology. This would only stifle the innovation capacity of the hundreds of thousands of talented engineers working in our industry. Unfortunately, we believe that the current CO2 proposal is not fully technology neutral. By setting a benchmark for low-emission vehicles, with a very narrow definition, it effectively pushes for pure battery electric vehicles and does not sufficiently consider other alternatives, such as plug-in hybrid technology. We really need to take a 360-degree view of the potential impacts of this, including the environmental, economic, and social dimensions. We need to ask, is this the best industrial strategy for Europe? And given that the final choice is in the hands of customers, is that what they really want and can afford? Indeed, when we consider that the market uptake of electric vehicles is directly correlated to GDP per capita, affordability is a major barrier. The fact that the market share of electrically chargeable cars is practically zero in the Euro countries with a GDP per capita below 17,000 euros says it all. Any bans or limitations on the internal combustion engine would therefore have potentially negative implications for consumers and society. In fact, it would impact the freedom of mobility. Hence, we believe that where vehicles access restrictions are under consideration, they should be coordinated and based on objective criteria, like the latest Euro emission standards. This would be less confusing and would encourage the uptake of newer, cleaner vehicles as well as alternative technologies. Diesel has proven particularly effective in reducing CO2 emissions because of its low fuel consumption. In fact, it is the biggest mass market contributor to decarbonization readily available. The rapid decline of diesel's market share that we are now seeing in some EU markets, which is almost exclusively offset by petrol, poses serious challenges for meeting CO2 reduction targets, not only those for 2030, but also those already set for 2021. We cannot forget that European policymakers actively promoted diesel for more than 15 years. As a result, our industry invested heavily in this technology from R&D and manufacturing point of view. This trend cannot simply be reversed overnight without huge structural problems in the automotive, petrochemical and service sectors. The move towards greater electrification should therefore be accompanied by a coherent strategy on how to manage the transition, starting with the charging infrastructure density. Our industry is fully committed to sustainable mobility and to further reduction of environmental footprint, with full respect for our customers' needs as well as the 12.6 million workers we employ directly and indirectly across Europe. A thriving, profitable business is a prerequisite for sustainability. After all, we want to make sure that we can produce clean vehicles that our customers want and can afford to buy. On Brexit, 2018 is also a pivotal year for the negotiations on the departure of the United Kingdom from the EU. ACEA welcomes recent progress to the second phase of the Brexit negotiations, which covers the framework for the future relationship as well as the transitional arrangements needed to get there. Today, the automotive industry of the EU and the UK are deeply integrated. Changes for this level of integration will most certainly have an adverse impact on manufacturers with operations in the EU, the UK, or both. This will be mainly felt in two areas. Firstly, restricted access to each other's markets due to the introduction of tariffs and custom procedures. The vision of containers with parts and components for automobile assembly stuck in long tailbacks outside ports on both sides of the channel is both realistic and very worrisome. Secondly, diverging regulatory frameworks resulting in increased complexity and higher production costs. It is therefore urgent to resolve the uncertainty on what lies ahead by coming to a swift conclusion on an agreement on the transitional period. As you can no doubt imagine, it is a struggle for our industry to make investment decisions when we don't know what is just around the corner. We believe that this transition period should be close to 3 years in order to give businesses the time they need to adapt to new realities and to allow for crucial facilities like custom infrastructure to be built to a level that can cope with the additional demands. After all, a political deal that reflects the business realities of European economic integration is the only way in which we can minimize the fallout of Brexit for our industry and the European economy in general. As a conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to highlight the following points. The European automobile industry is on a pathway to recovery, coming close to pre-crisis levels in terms of sales and production figures after 10 years. But in light of major regulations ahead of us, as well as the threat of Brexit, this recovery is very fragile. We must therefore maximize efforts to safeguard the global industry competitiveness. This means, for CO2, we need a truly technology-neutral approach with a well-balanced plan for a gradual shift to low and zero-emission vehicles, limiting the economic and social impact. On Brexit, we urgently need clarity on what lies ahead through a swift agreement on the transitional period. But I would like to conclude in terms of CO2 by sharing with you the fact that a minimal density level for charging infrastructure is a precondition for achieving the CO2 objectives. This needs to be the responsibility and the commitment of the EU members, as we cannot force customers to buy electrified products that they could not charge. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Tavares. So Mr. Armstrong is now going to talk you through the slides we left on your chair on the global situation for automobiles.
So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate the invitation. So I'm from IHS, and just to note that, of course, we're an independent body, that we're a commentator on the industry. We're not affiliated with a particular body or policy initiatives, but we thought it'd be useful to give you an overview of the global industry. I'm going to try and take you around the world in the next 15 minutes, which is going to be a little bit of a challenge, but if I can hit on some of the high points about where growth is and how growth is changing around the world, that could be of interest. So you have your slides as a reference point. I think the first point to say that growth GDP growth globally was pretty robust in 2017, and it will be robust again in 2018. The question is the momentum there really going to translate into the auto industry? Demand for light vehicles has been good for the last 9-10 years, practically since the global financial crisis, posting record gains every year. China is slowing down. Will that continue is a question we'll try to answer. And likewise, Western Europe. We've seen a synchronized recovery in the mature markets. Can Western Europe keep recovering, or do we have a new threshold in the industry as mobility changes, for example? And then the impact clearly in Europe is around Brexit. Trade negotiations are still mired in uncertainty. There is a number of investment risks that abound around Brexit. Diesel and the composition of how the industry is fueled and the energy given to the industry is changing rapidly. Diesel is in free fall. Where is the bottom? Perhaps we can talk a little bit about that. And what is going to be ahead for supporting European production? Is it going to come from exports? Will it be local? We'll provide a view of that. But the first point then, just to touch on some of these things, global GDP growth has been in the ascendant for the last 2, 3, 4 years, driven by the motor of consumer demand in the US, for example. Obviously driven by strong demand in China, although that is now trending towards more sustainable levels. And even the Eurozone has been pretty good. In 2017, 2.5% growth, something like a 10-year high in terms of overall GDP growth. Synchronized economic growth amongst the big economies is helping. And the recovery in the southern markets as well, both in the auto sector but also around the economies. Now, the UK is the outlier here. Clearly, Brexit is a significant negative to the economy, and the ranges of how much has been impacted have varied. But perhaps the UK in 2017 performed a little better than the expectations. It didn't go into recession. It's down to about 1.8%. It doesn't feel so bad, but this masks significant structural adjustments in the UK economy that need to take place. And a lot of that is mired in uncertainty. So we still see the UK as a laggard for sure in the years ahead. Next year is 2018 is 1.2% growth for the UK, but it's certainly not the engine of growth that it could have been under perhaps different circumstances. China at about 6.6% next year, but the global economy at about 3.3%. Still solid demand. Solid demand from the consumer coming out of the US. But here we see a slight dislocation between the economic growth and the growth in the auto industry, because we've had a lot of growth already. A lot of that's been built in as the auto industry has recovered. So if you turn to the next slide, how did we do in 2017? Well, growth for the light vehicle demand, 2.4% to 94.5 million units. We're beginning to see the structure of growth shift again. After the global financial crisis, it went to emerging markets. Then we saw this recovery in developed economies, Europe and North America. Now that's slowing. China's slowing again. So we're moving in 2018 to a more of a steady state market. It's good. The industry's doing well. But the growth is falling from about 2.5%, as I said, to about half that, 1.5% in 2018, as growth goes basically flat out of China with the adjustments that they're having in terms of their taxation policy. We're actually looking to South Asia and some recovery in Eastern Europe as the main drivers of growth in the auto industry, which is unusual, right? Typically it's been the big players, but we're seeing those plateauing of growth out of those markets, and it's actually the marginals, if I can put it that way, that are driving what little growth there is in the industry. But so we're at a record level, nearly 96 million light vehicle sales. China still demanding 1 out of every 3 vehicles on the planet will be bought in China, is being bought in China, with further growth potential. But we have something of it feels like a bit like a slowdown in the automotive market. Looking further ahead, if you look at the global light vehicle outlook long term here, we still see there's growth in the industry. This is still a growth story. The composition continues to move towards emerging markets. China will be another 10 million units in the next 10 years or so. It's already 28 million. So significant growth there, but we've definitely reached a plateau in the mature markets in North America and Europe, so very little growth being driven out of those economies, with substantial change to how transport is being consumed as we move away from car as a product to mobility as a service. We've done a lot of work on how mobility is transforming those mature economies as we begin to consume mobility differently at a city level and at a rural level, as opposed to a kind of country demographic level. So significant growth to come in the industry, but the composition of that growth is changing pretty rapidly. Just a note on China, I just mentioned there, China has been the engine of growth for the last 10 years. It's basically flat market this year, so significant challenges in terms of feeding what is essentially flat demand. We have actually less than 1% growth in China. And that is really something new. It hasn't seen that in the entire industrialization process. So the government is going to be watching that very closely because it's being used as an engine of growth for the economy. But we do think long term the growth in China is back. So it's a holding year, but we return to growth in 2019 at a more sustainable level. In terms of risks, perhaps actually there are some risks on the upside actually, if you can actually see China perhaps do a little bit better than we think. Certainly around Brexit and the trade deal going out a couple of years, we have significant risks with regard to the auto industry. I'll talk a little bit more about those. But there's another risk, of course, into the industry, and that is the composition of how the energy is powered, as I've said before. Significant changes in legislation, significant movement away from diesel, the testing of new electrification technologies which are yet to be proved with the consumer. This is really an industry in a state of flux that is going to need to be kind of monitored closely and heavily analysed, if I can put it that way, to understand actually where demand is going to fall going forward. So risks in terms of composition and electrification are pretty significant. And then there's the risks around, geopolitical risk around Donald Trump and so forth, where the politics and the economics have been somewhat disconnected. Well, perhaps these two will get reconnected, but for the time being, the US economy is just doing really well from a consumer point of view, buoyed by tax cuts and so on and so forth. So for the time being, politics and economics are just moving along in parallel in the Trump sphere, if I can put it that way, with no real hard connection. But there's a risk out there. The same pattern then for Western Europe. We're seeing demand actually come back pretty strongly last few years. In 2017 it was about 2.5% growth in recovery from the southern economies, but already the fear of Brexit weighing heavily on Western Europe, right? So United Kingdom passenger car market down nearly 6%, Ireland actually knock-on effects coming from the uncertainty there. So a mixed bag as regards Western Europe. And we think, and our forecasts are similar to those from ACEA, that in 2018 that growth continues to slow. As Brexit weighs on the UK, we have a negative market, perhaps 4 or 5%, with some downside risk. The engines of growth from Germany and France are subsiding, and so really we have, again, a kind of stasis, a holding pattern for Western Europe at about 14.5 million passenger cars. Just talking to the composition then, the diesel mix, the electrification mix, the CO2, these are all balls up in the air that the industry is juggling with. Our view of diesel, our estimates around 44% now. The West European diesel share is diesel, having fallen from the high penetration markets, particularly France and Germany, of 3/4 just a few years ago. So this is in structural and secular decline. The question is, where does it land? Now our view, which admittedly we've undercalled diesel for a while, but the city restrictions, the cost of real driving emissions, the technology loading requiring, this is all weighing on the industry. So our view, by around 2020 we're at or below 40%. And then around 30 by 2025. But a lot is in play. You're actually measuring a lot of things to get to this number. And then CO2, obviously there are some significant targets and they were spoken about before. This is a challenge for the industry. Actually the composition and the reduction in CO2 in 2017 slowed. If you look at the decline, partially because diesel is now being exited and people are not buying diesel. Partially because we have a segment shift into SUVs, and SUVs typically are more CO2 emitting, and so there's part consumer here. Actually, the consumer is driving a fair amount of this. Technology is going to drive that a bit going forward, but this is the environment with which the industry is grappling in Western Europe for the next 5 years. From the production side, just to finish off, the global production footprint is obviously following where the demand is going. 6 million units now of production going into China between now and 2025. Another 5 million going into South Asia. So this is where the demand is taking place. Comparatively small for Europe, as the demand is somewhere else in the world, although it's the export story in Europe that is helping drive demand, and has been doing so with some success over the last few years. Indeed, if you look now in 2018, growth in production out of Europe is undermined, of course, by the demand coming out of the UK. It's still finding some solace in the demand from the rest of the world, particularly APAC and rest of the world. A couple of years ago, it was more a story going into North America, but as we see localization medium term shifting to these demand markets, that's a long-term trend that might come under pressure. But for now, it's that export position which is holding up the industry. And most of the production that is coming, of course, into Europe is coming into Central Europe, and there's a risk around production locations clearly in the UK, and with the lack of clarity that the industry is dealing with, as is all residents of the UK as well. That's obviously playing on the investment. If you saw some numbers today from the SMMT, investment in the UK was £1.1 billion, I think, for the last year. Pre-Brexit, 2.5. So it's in a holding pattern in terms of where that production location goes. So just to kind of finish off in the whirlwind, I think I'm just about at my 15 minutes. So the industry is doing well, right? So the economy is doing well. We have one of the highest levels of global economic growth seen for some time. But most of that growth in the industry has been factored in through North America, through China, and the recovery in Europe. So now we're actually seeing that has been caught up. So even though we have strong growth for 2018 in the global economy, less of that is now feeding through into the automotive industry. At the same time, although you have that flatness in the mature markets, you have a lot going on underneath that in terms of the composition of how transport is being consumed, and then how you power the vehicles that are sold, and the movement from where we are now to where we are in 10 years, that the industry looks significantly different as those technology choices are made. So the industry has got a lot of calculation to do to respond to those impacts. But the level of investment in the industry, if you think about technology loading into a vehicle and a vehicle becoming essentially a technology sink, that's a good place to be globally in terms of an industry that is actually generating returns in the supplier base in particular. So it's a very dynamic industry driven by those regulatory and technology changes. So I'll just stop there, and I think Mr. Tavares and myself would be happy to answer any questions if you have any.
Before we open the floor to your questions, just to point out that Mr. Tavares is speaking today in his capacity of President of ACEA, so we won't be taking company-specific questions. So with that in mind, if you could just say your name, your media outlet, and all questions in English, please. Yes,
Hi, it's Josh Masana from Politico. My question is just about the 3-year transition phase. You say roughly 3 years. Can you be a little bit more specific about how long you feel you need? Is it exactly 3 years or a bit less, a bit more maybe? And why that time span was calculated? Why not 2 or 4 years? Thanks.
Well, thank you for your question. It is related to investment, to the fact that when you make an investment in the automotive industry, you want to make sure that you get the appropriate return for the sustainability of your company. And therefore, for the investments that have already been done, we need to know how things are going to unfold in the next 3 years, assuming that some investments were already done in the past, which is quite obvious. What we know today is that everybody is holding on to see if the conditions under which we would invest for the future deserve this investment in terms of return. Which means if we don't know what is going to be the future framework of the post-Brexit economic conditions, then we can assume that we will not have investment in the near future, which of course will be very damaging for the industry and for Europe as a whole. So this is the reason 3 years is about what we need to make sure that the investments already done will be reaching the return that was expected, that in the meanwhile, if we don't have visibility on the Brexit outcome, the problem will be that investments will be suspended, and if they are suspended, of course, there are consequences for the future.
Hi, my name is Anya Nussbaum from Bloomberg News. Could you tell us, Mr. Tavares, what your take is on animal and human testing of car emissions? And also, a few months ago, you mentioned 2 Brexit scenarios you were working on. Is it an approach that you also are using at the ACEA? And if so, what are these 2 scenarios?
Well, on the first topic, it is clear that it is unacceptable. It is clear that the ACEA has not discussed this matter at this stage, and I don't think there is anything else to add to the statements that have already been made by the leaders of the relevant car companies. But of course, ACEA's position is that it is unacceptable. For your second topic, on the scenarios, when I was addressing that question, it was in my position of PSA Group CEO, talking about the competitiveness of our manufacturing system. I think the members of the ACEA who have their manufacturing facilities in the UK will have to address it in their own strategic thinking. And as the ACEA President, I don't have to address their specific strategies, but I believe that the competitiveness of what exists in terms of manufacturing inside of the UK in their ability to export is going to be the key question for everybody.
Yes, here down the back.
Hello, I'm Marie Lauchet from AFP, Agence France Presse. I'd like to know if you're following the Mercosur discussions and what you think so far about it.
Well, we believe that everything that supports free trade is positive overall, because we believe that bringing the most affordable and safe mobility to all parts of the world is part of our mission. So far, we see that this free trade can open some opportunities for Europe and possibly for wider collaboration, if not exports from Europe. So we are eager to see an agreement be made between Mercosur and the European Union. I think this is something that can help the European automotive industry to unleash our full potential in terms of technology, safety, mobility and comfort for our products. So we are eager to see this happening.
With the Wall Street Journal, you mentioned regulatory divergence after Brexit. I was curious as to what you make of the Trump administration's review of the emission standards that President Obama put in place right before leaving office. If there's a rollback of those, would it cause any competitive damage to European exporters, and what would that regulatory divergence, especially in light of what the Commission is proposing now, mean for European car makers? Thank you.
Well, it's a great question. You know, regulations, divergence in general, are not helpful to bring the most affordable safest and cleanest mobility devices to the people. So from a pure society viewpoint, we believe that if we have an harmonized regulation scheme, it will help the automotive industry to be more efficient, to bring at a faster pace, lower emissions, higher safety, more comfort, more connectivity to the consumers. Everything which is divergent in terms of regulations is just going to slow down the process and the speed at which we will be able to bring all of those good things to the consumer. So overall, we are really promoters of regulatory convergence. We believe it is good. Beyond the fact that it's good for the consumer and for the societies and for the humanity, we also understand that in some cases regulatory divergence will be used for other means than just giving the consumers the best possible mobility devices, which means we are very eager to see everything converge. It is fair to say that there has been some steps of progress, but overall there is still a lot to be done on that area.
Hello, Philip Bennington from Reuters. I wanted to ask a bit about some of the graphs here. You're quite kind of candid in terms of saying what the difference was related to a forecast before and the reality.
Yeah.
And I just wondered, particularly in the case of, I see that you, as it were, undercalled Western Europe. I just wondered, in terms of the UK and Ireland, which obviously the two markets which have, in Western Europe at least, which have gone down.
Yeah.
Were you this pessimistic, or have they actually kind of fared worse than you expected? Have they fared or better? And also, maybe you can just explain, sort of, within those markets which are declining. Obviously, the UK is still in the EU. Why exactly? Is it all consumers? Is it business? Business cars, for example. Where exactly are the cars that are not being sold? What explains that?
So I think here we see, the difference between forecasting the overall economic adjustment that's taking place in the UK, and then if you look sector by sector, there can be a deviation. So overall in the UK, the decline in growth that was predicted and that various analysts thought that was going to come in 2017 was less robust or less pronounced. There were certainly fears that following Brexit, we could have the economy straight into recession. That didn't happen. It didn't happen for a variety of reasons. Clearly, the pound has been under significant pressure, and exports have done perhaps a little better than first thought. But then think about everything that's going on in the industry with regard to how the consumer is consuming transport. And it's perhaps just as much a diesel story as it is a macroeconomic growth story or an income story. There's a wait-and-see attitude with regard to which powertrain you're going to invest in terms of your new vehicle. You have the London City talking about restrictions in the same way that we've had Paris and so forth. And so people are feeling cautious about investing in big ticket items, and of course after your house your car is your biggest investment. So in fact we kind of undercalled the economy, but we overcalled the decline, or we overcalled the decline in the auto market was significant, right? So it's already about 6% in the UK. And the second question was?
Well, basically, you partly answered it, but the decline in cars, is it generally consumers, or is it? It is definitely across the board. I mean, you do have one of the biggest fleets in the UK. The fleet market is pretty significant. But if you think about how people consume fleets, typically they are larger vehicles. Typically they may be more likely to be diesel because the kilometres done are more likely to be diesel. So in this sense, I think it's. We can check the numbers and come back to you. But in this sense, the consumer is voting significantly with their purchasing power.
Hello, Robert Hodgson for Euractiv. Can you go into some more detail, please, about your objections to the emissions standards proposed by the Commission? Because you said that they're effectively not technology neutral. Will not a shift to small cars, for example, allow you to continue manufacturing conventional cars, you know, and then maybe target the more expensive end of the market with electric cars who would otherwise be buying SUVs? That's one question. And the other one, you mentioned that there's not going to be a market for electric cars without a rollout of a high-density infrastructure network. Does that mean that if somehow a high-density infrastructure network came to be rolled out as a result of some political targeting, then you would be happy with the switch and not object so much to the emission standards? Sorry,
well, we are, first of all, I want you to understand that we are very eager as an industry to move as fast as we can towards zero-emission vehicles. That has to be very clear. At the same time, we have the responsibility of 12.6 million people who are working in our industry in Europe, and we want to do things in a way that is acceptable for everybody in the industry, which means moving to zero-emission vehicles, which is the goal of our industry, means that we need to convince our customers that this is the best choice for them in terms of total cost of ownership, in terms of convenience. And of course, you can easily understand that if in the objectives which are set, there is an understated objective for low emission vehicles or for electric vehicles, it has to be a mix of sales that is consistent with the expectations of the consumers, which means those vehicles need to be sold naturally because the consumer sees a competitive total cost of ownership and a good convenience in the way we are using their cars, which means access to everywhere he wants to go, and means finding a recharging unit or a charging station in a convenient manner. Which means that if we don't take care of this important topic, we will end up with some significant difficulties. And let me highlight two possibilities. If we have a situation where to meet the CO2 objectives, we need to sell a significant mix of zero-emission vehicles beyond the customer demand because of the perceived lack of convenience of this kind of vehicles, because the density of charging network would be not what it should be in the eyes of the consumer, then we need to push those vehicles in the market. If we push those vehicles in the market, of course, there are economic consequences for the companies, and there may be some social consequences as an outcome of that situation. So if we want to keep this in a dynamic positive mode, we should say, okay, we want to meet this level of objective at this specific milestone, but ahead of this milestone, we need to have another milestone, which is sometime before, we need to show the consumer that the density level of the charging network is meeting its own reassurance expectation, which means that then the consumer will buy an electric vehicle without having the anxiety of not being able to find in a convenient manner a charging unit on the day-by-day use. And this is very important. So if we want to move in the right direction in a sincere and a smooth, efficient way, we need to set this level of density as a commitment from the EU members, from the states, where they commit that sometime before the deadline of the CO2 emission, they will install a significant level of density of the charging units. If this is done, then the market will be natural. If this is done, the consumers will naturally come to zero-emission vehicles because they will feel that it is, of course, cleaner, it will be convenient, they will have no problems in charging their vehicles, and therefore they will come, which means that then the sales will not push it to the market, which means we'll be able to achieve those CO2 objectives with a natural business meeting the expectations of our consumers, and everything will be positive from there. Reversely, if we just put the pressure on the industry to bring as many electric vehicles as needed, which of course we are all investing in now, and the industry as a whole is investing now, and at the end of the day, the consumers are not demanding those vehicles because they feel that the convenience is not where it should be, given the perceived lack of density of the charging network, then we would put our industry in a significant difficulty situation, because either we don't sell those vehicles, we don't meet the CO2 objectives, and we have huge penalties, which put our companies in stress, or we need to push those vehicles to the market with significant level of incentives, and then margins become thin or negative, and then it means our companies need to restructure. So these are the two scenarios I would like to avoid. And in order to avoid those two black scenarios and keep everything smooth and positive, I think we need to have a very clear, transparent and honest discussion by saying, yes, those objectives can be met because we are investing in the technology. We will have all the technology and the vehicles in time or on time, but then you need to convince the consumer to go naturally in that direction. And one way to convince them is to show them that you have invested as a state member of the EU what is appropriate to have the right level of charging network density. So the two things go hand in hand. And of course, in the eyes of the consumer, before you buy the car, you need to see that you have the charging units in your day-by-day life, which I think these two things need to be connected, and so far, in our eyes, they have not been connected properly in order to ensure the natural demand of the consumer.
Okay, I'm afraid we're just a little bit, we have one time for a last question, if it's, okay.
Lorenzo Di Pietro, RAI Italian Public TV. ACEA calls for slowing down of emission reductions, while in China, California, and several other American states, there's an increasing stringent ruling that creates boosting favorable conditions for boosting investments towards electric cars. While in the European market, I think to FCA, an example, they don't even have an electric or a hybrid vehicle for the European market. Don't you think that European manufacturers are losing their industrial and technological leadership? Why don't you do like Toyota, who simply said no more diesel?
Well, you know, it's a great point, and it opens the discussion on a very relevant topic. The ACEA fully understands that we are moving towards zero emission. There is absolutely no any thinking about anything else than just moving as fast as we can towards zero emission vehicles. This is the ACEA position, and I think that most, if not all, the ACEA members have announced a certain level of electrification for their portfolios in the future. So we understand, and we are eager to move in that direction. We understand this is the future. Zero emission vehicles is the future, no doubt about it. We also understand that we need to move as fast as we can. Why do we need to move as fast as we can? Because exactly of your very fair question. Because in some other areas of the world, we may even face more stringent regulations, like China or California. But we are also responsible people. While we understand that we need to move fast, because we need to protect the competitiveness of the European industry vis-à-vis the automotive industry of Asia and the automotive industry of North America, and we understand that, so we need to move fast to protect this competitiveness as an automotive industry in Europe vis-à-vis the rest of the world. We also need to make it in a way that makes it acceptable for the companies, which means we need also to transform our companies at a pace which is something that the companies are able to digest. If we don't respect that, then we in some way would destroy our own industry, which means that it will create a penalty for the automotive European industry vis-à-vis the rest of the world. So you see, we have two boundaries. One is the speed at which we need to progress to be competitive vis-à-vis the automakers in China and the automakers in North America. And it is fair to say that we need to progress fast, and nobody challenged that. And on the other side, the speed at which we need to progress should not self-destroy our companies, because we will be going too fast and destroying the capability of our company by not being able to sustain this pace of transformation. And one way to put our European companies in trouble is going too fast, destroying the margins of the company, and not giving the company the ability to continue to invest in the future. So you see, you have these two levels. What is the level that we can sustain in terms of transformation of the company itself? And what is the minimal level of progress we should need to be competitive vis-à-vis the rest of the world? And we are moving in this funnel, which is of course not easy, as you may imagine. And one of the reasons why it is not easy is because we all know, you and me, that over the last 20 years, we were encouraged to go in a technology direction which now is considered as not being the right one. So we were all moving in one direction, supported by all sorts of regulations and taxes. And suddenly, then we say, well, this is not the right direction, let's move to another direction. And this change, this brutal change in direction, of course, is a significant challenge for our companies. And we just need to recognize that we are human beings. We need to move all of this organization in another direction, make the appropriate investments, make those investments realize, and make sure that we can bring to the market all the electrified products that we have all announced. As you know, looking at the statements of each CEO of the automotive European companies. So the challenge is moving in that funnel, and I can assure you that we are eager to move as fast as we can, but we are also responsible leaders, and we want to protect also the sustainability of the company, because of course there is a social responsibility also which is linked with this.